Well, hello. Welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. Robin Hogarth is a British-born international producer, songwriter, composer, and arranger. In recent years, Robin has won 2 Grammys as producer for 2 albums from the Soweto Gospel Choir. His early career as a musician found him in the schoolboy band, the Maximilian King Trio, a Rhodesian band that moved to South Africa in the late 60s. Then the pop folk band Humphrey, recording and releasing an album in 1971. A few years later, in the late 70s and early 80s, he recorded a couple of singles with the band Albatross. In 1987, Mr. Hogarth began writing music for TV and film and did so for several successful years. Robin's affinity for African roots and folk music led him to work with the members of Johnny Clegg's band and the aforementioned Soweto Gospel Choir in the new millennium. He composed the soundtrack to the We Are Together documentary for the Children of Agape Project, as well as working on the collaborative Gondwana Dawn Project. His music has been used in productions across the globe. And my guest has stayed active in heading up workshops for uplifting communities. Well, welcome, Robin. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure. Nice to meet you, Greg.
Nice to meet you. Well, take us back to the beginning. Talk about where you were born.
I was born in London. My parents were very, I guess, British. They actually met during the Second World War. And I think by the time I was more or less aware of what was going on, I mean, I loved London. We lived in Kensington there and the park and the round pond. But my parents both wanted to get away from England and away from what had been the whole war thing. And my dad got a job in what was then Northern Rhodesia. And I remember at the age of 10, myself and my brother, who was 2 years younger, we got onto one of these ocean liners, which was very exciting, going across the equator, getting used to the concept of a southern hemisphere, if you like. And we arrived in Cape Town. My dad had bought a little Austin car, and we drove all the way up from Cape Town to Northern Rhodesia, a distance that must have been about, I don't know, 2,000 miles, or no, possibly a bit less. But I remember the roads were very, very interesting. There were these strip roads and some interesting moments, and moments like getting hit by a raindrop, which was about 10 times the size of any raindrop I'd ever seen in Africa. And there were a whole lot of adventures. But that's how I ended up in Africa. Having said all that, just about every piece of education I had was very colonial. So wherever you were, you did a British syllabus, English syllabus, and O levels and A levels eventually. And that's sort of that background.
Okay. Well, early on, do you recall hearing any music being played in the house?
Oh, yes. Both my parents were very musical. So even in England, in earlier days, both of them played the piano. My father was a multi-instrumentalist. He played a trumpet, mouth organ, various odd things. So we were surrounded by music, and we would sing along with them, and we'd get into the harmonies and the various odd things. They had record collections of all kinds of music, which I would get, Harry Belafonte, a whole lot of other things. And I was very fortunate in that music for me was like second nature. It felt like that. I could hear harmonies, I could hear instruments, and that was very fortunate that I'd meet. It was only when I went to school that I found that a lot of people didn't really have that kind of background.
Right.
So there was music all around.
All around. Well, then it kind of made sense that you played piano at an early age, since both of your parents did.
That's right.
Yeah, they were encouraging. Yeah.
They were very encouraging. And I was fortunate in that, yeah, the piano is basically a basic form of discipline, musical discipline. But I remember I must have started when I was about 8 or 9. And I remember in early times having problems with the formality of learning piano. It was really, really useful, but I would find that I had a good ear. So rather than read the music, I would hear the piano teacher playing the piece, and then I would just hear it and play it. As I started hitting 9, 10, 11, 12 or whatever, there was a friend of mine at boarding school. By then I was at a boarding school, who played the mandolin and the ukulele, I think. And he showed me, and I learned how like 4 strings would go together. And I remember writing home and saying, I want a guitar for my birthday. So the piano was fine, but it seemed fairly rigid and formal and a bit classical and so on. And I got home, and there was this bright yellow African acoustic guitar. And I taught it to myself. And that really was my passion. And then I started having groups, and the Maximilian King Trio that you mentioned earlier was started at school with a couple of school friends. And I also early on was writing music. I knew that I had an interest in doing that. I had the first record I ever bought was Kathy's Clown.
Everyone others, yeah.
You remember? Yeah. And funnily enough, I just was seeing a documentary about the Beatles, and they used to practice those harmonies before they were able. And I was a bit like that. I liked that idea, like and I would copy this, learn the chords. I was into the Shadows. Bruce Welch, the rhythm guitarist for the Shadows, you know, he down, 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 and he was going junk, 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 and I couldn't believe the speed at which he was playing the guitar, and I sat for days learning to be able to play it that quickly and hit it. So that's some of my background.
Well, you know, talking about yes, I've heard how influential he was. Well, the Shadows, but especially, you know, the rhythm guitar that he played was so influential, and and helped. You know, a lot of guitarists got their start, like you said, you know, just mimicking and listening to that music.
Yes.
You mentioned ukulele too. Interesting, because in doing these interviews, I hear how a lot of musicians, that was their first instrument. You know, maybe because it was affordable, maybe because, you know, I don't know what really, you know, took place, but I've heard that. I have heard that. Well, talk about, was there at that time, when, let's say you're a teenager, were there any record shops around? Anything like that?
Yes, you could buy records. They were relatively rare and relatively expensive.
Okay.
You'd have radio. The school that I eventually went to in Rhodesia, as it was actually I got a good scholarship. We didn't have money, but the sons of some very rich people went to that school, and they'd go to England and come back with the latest like Beatles album or something, and you'd hear it before anyone else. So there were records around, but it was a slight luxury, I guess.
Right. Well, how about one of the first live shows that you attended, that you went to?
You mean like watching an artist, that sort of thing? I have to say, I know Guy's history, so I didn't really go to anything that I would mention. What you mentioned my folk roots. I was very interested in folk music, and in a lot of the areas that I was in, there were folk clubs, and I would go and watch people whose names I don't know if I even remember them, and I don't know if you would know them, but they'd be doing Peter, Paul, and Mary, or Where Have All the Flowers Gone, or, you know, these sort of classics at the
Right.
time. And I guess what impressed me a lot with them was the way they played acoustic guitar. So that was an area which I started to get into, so I could now finger pick and do various odd styles that way. And the other thing with that, which we've mentioned already, was harmony. Harmony was my passion. So right from the very beginning, I'd have like two school friends in a band. They weren't particularly musicians, but they could sing. I'd play the guitar and I'd do the harmonies. I'd work out the harmonies, I'd write out stuff. And I got quite good at that, and I really loved it.
You really did that. Well, talk a little bit about the Maximilian King Trio, how you guys got together and all that history.
Right. So that was again a school band, but having said that, actually the other two guys were from different schools. I'd been we there was someone who was a school friend who introduced me to someone else who had what he said was a band. I say that I remember going to an audition. I must have been 14 or something like this. And I was as nervous as can be because I thought this was an audition for the first band that I was going to play. And they looked at me and they were very, yes, okay, now I can join the band. So I went then to the first rehearsal and I found out that the band leader couldn't play an instrument really. He thought he could play bass guitar, but he was hitting the notes and he didn't have any sense of rhythm. And I've always been very affable. I didn't really say anything to him, but I did. We got that band kind of went slightly to pieces, but two of the members of it became with me the Maximilian King Trio, and we didn't have any. Maximilian King was just a made-up name. I think we did a radio interview at some time, and we tell this long story about meeting some black Negro singer from the South whose name was Maximilian King. Anyway, it was completely not. It was all created. But I was writing really all the music. The one guy, a very good friend of mine, had a lovely, lovely voice. He could hit these high notes, and I wrote a couple of songs for him so that he could actually hit those notes. We started, you know, I don't know, you're kind of at school. I had no idea. I must admit, I was sort of much more interested in the music than I was really in performing. But I had the idea that we needed to get out there. And this was like Rhodesia. I remember going to a restaurant and saying, don't you want, you know, some guys to play some music for you? And of course, there was for sure no money in it whatsoever. And the three of us would like sit in a corner with all these diners eating away, not listening to a thing. But then I started to learn about the subject of communication, because then what I would do is I'd get someone's eye, catch someone's eye, and they would actually start like listening. And then, and so the Maximilian King Trio became more and more known. But then I was reaching the end of school, so I moved to South Africa, and the other two guys didn't want to come to South Africa. So I kept the format, got another couple of guys. And my first wife I met had at that time was working for someone called Nico Carstens. Nico, a lovely guy, an incredible Afrikaans accordion player, and very famous actually in South Africa, running a music publishing company and so on. And so we auditioned for him. And we did, you know, what were in fact two singles with him, and that took me to the recording side of things. And one of those singles did pretty well on the hit parades in South Africa. And I guess you could say I was off with a career. I think I remember getting my first royalty check and actually putting it up on the wall, and it was for. It was something like R1.70, which probably is about 20 cents or something like that. But I was so proud of this because this was my music, and for the first time I'd money out of it. I wasn't really interested in the money like a lot of music guys, but just the fact that someone would pay money for my music. Wow.
Yes, yes, exactly. You should have posted that, or you put it on your wall, stuff, the picture of it or the actual brand up
No,
there.
absolutely. Those are the days I didn't
Your
think
first one.
of any of those things, but you're right. Yeah.
Was that single you're referring to, Lullaby and Rain? Was that one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well done. You know more than I do nearly.
Jogging the memory a little bit. Yeah, and
That's great.
you guys played on TV as well as live. What was it
Yeah.
like being on TV?
So TV actually came earlier than this for a strange reason, was that my stepfather and my mother were on Rhodesian television. And my mother was actually quite famous. She was one of those people you walk around down the street with her, and you know, people would shout out her name and stuff like that. And she gave us a slot on. She had like what would you call it, a sort of a general affairs program, different things. She'd interview different people, and the three of us. I think back to those days. Somehow we had done some recordings with someone, and they were quite all right, and we sort of mimed to that because they weren't really set up to have a band, and it was a folk music. I'm not sure how it went down, but I enjoyed it a lot, although it was very nerve-wracking. And among other things, I remember on her program, I had to model some children's clothes. That was a completely different sort of thing. I wasn't singing anything. So yeah, what was good about that was getting through that that stage of people filming you or whatever, and getting a bit used to that, even though it was nerve-wracking.
Yes, a little of the publicity and that being in front of a camera. And then one of your songs, Janine, was played on a cult radio station.
Indeed, that probably in my earlier years was the most successful song. That was now South Africa, and there was almost a pirate radio station called LM, which was Lorenzo Marx, which was the place, the country, Mozambique, if you like, that was near us. Actually, it was called Portuguese East Africa then. And it got a lot of airplay. It went up the hit parade and arrived somewhere in some single figures up the hit parade.
Well, going up a little bit here, how did the band Humphrey come together?
A different story, which did take me into the film and TV area. There was a friend of mine who, much older guy, but I happened to know him, who was making films in South Africa. And he knew me and he knew a bit of my music and so on. And he came to me one day and he said, Robin, I'd really like you to meet someone who's working with me in the film business. And that's a guy called Robbie Kallenbach. By then, I was married to Lisa Hogarth. And Lisa she's still around. We're long since divorced, but we're very good friends, and we had 2 kids together. Another story. Anyway, so Chris brought Robbie round to meet me, and he was about my age. We'd left school by then, and he had a guitar, and we started playing. And Lisa was really good with lyrics. She actually, she is the one that I told you was working for Nico Cossins, and she'd done a lot of lyrics for Nico in Africa as well as in English. And so the 3 of us formed the band Humphrey. And we started writing a lot of music. Robbie and I, some, singly, some together, some collaborations, and very often with Lisa writing the lyrics, and that was Humphrey.
Okay. Yeah, I like that was my first introduction to you, was through that 1971 album.
Oh, yes. You sent me a link to that. I remember. I was amazed because I hadn't heard of that particular compilation. It was fantastic.
Yes. And I'm sure I'll discover. I'm familiar with some of the bands on there, but I'll discover some other ones. I haven't listened to it quite yet. But Yes, I like the album. Nice pop folk with harmonies. Again, there's the harmonies, and I like
Yes,
the added orchestration with the horns and strings. I thought
yeah.
that was a nice addition. Really made it stand out.
No, well, thank you. We were very fortunate in that Lisa, working for a record company, had those sort of lines. And she had an incredibly talented brother, Zane Cronier, who actually did the string arrangements and so on. So we got, and somehow she managed to wangle a reasonable budget, because those kind of things were incredibly expensive um, in those days, and you didn't sort of see it so often. So we were very fortunate. We had a great team of people working on the album.
Yeah, it's nice production too. Nice sound comes through on that. Of course, there's a single "Down Down." That's
Yeah,
a nice track. But I
yeah.
like the opening track, "Nowhere World," with the strings again on
Mm.
that one. Really nice.
Well, thank you very much.
And then the others that I enjoyed were "Time to Change," in the Morning, and "Planet 43." Another,
Ah,
yeah, yeah,
Planet 43, I actually wrote, and it was in that time when you sort of went a bit science fiction if you had to, but with a humanitarian angle. So
yeah.
that Planet 43 could have been anywhere, but the idea was an ideal universe, perhaps, or world.
Right, right. But do you remember how the album fared upon release?
As I think you probably found out, it was very well received with the media and so on. Um, but it hit some sort of area where music wasn't being promoted or something. I mean, there were some strange things happening in South Africa. It was the apartheid era. Um, there were a lot of difficulties with the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which was basically run by the government, and had its whole apartheid lines.
Yeah,
A lot of those areas, the official areas, were Afrikaans. We, as a band, were not Afrikaans, although Lisa could speak Afrikaans, but nothing we were doing was really in the Afrikaans market. Uh, so it kind of fell, I think, on a few deaf ears at the time.
right, right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, the social and political situation at the time. And you started, you know, talking about that right there. That was one of my questions. Uh, were you ever in any situation where you felt intimidated or threatened at all?
Yes, not from a musical point of view. I guess the music is part of the thing. The beautiful thing about music is, as you know from everything you've done, it knows no barriers. There's
Right,
certainly there aren't really racial barriers or whatever. You do get different kinds of music, of course, and there's jazz players and there's folk players and there's traditional players. There's all sorts of things. So I what had happened with me is I was very interested a bit. You mentioned Planet 43, but Planet 43 is not a political song, but I was very aware of the problems around me, and I was not happy about it. And what an opportunity came up where, funnily enough, with Soweto Gospel Choir later, I was asked, would I be the choir master for a choir? And it was a multiracial choir at a time when that was pretty much a no-no. It was the first time I ran into the political problem. I really enjoyed the challenge of being a choir master, because that took me up a notch. There was a lot of music and there were a lot of different parts. I'd sung in choirs, but working this way was interesting also because I suppose it may have been half white and half black, and the talents were very different. The black singers were much more soul-y, if you like,
right.
whereas the white guys were more rigid, trained in opera or whatever they were trained in. Anyway, so it was a great thing to do. But almost immediately, I was informed that we were being surveilled if you like, by the security police. And they had a beautiful name, BOSS, which is the Bureau of State Security. And it is a bit like the books. I mean, it's really, really, really was crazy. I mean, there were raids, there were the choir, particularly the black guys, but all round wanted to perform in Soweto, in the black township areas. They actually couldn't take the white members of the choir. It was a problem. It was a security problem. It was anything could have happened. So the black members of the choir would go and visit areas and do positive things, hopefully with the community and so on. And there were raids, and funnily enough, I'm sort of jumping ahead a bit, but the Bureau of State Security, yeah, they were watching, and it definitely restricted, obviously, the feeling of what you could do musically. Fortunately, far later on, when Nelson Mandela got out of jail and the government totally changed, my background proved to be a total asset. You know, the fact, although I wasn't a political fighter or anything like that, I was on the right political side, if you like.
and that always helps. Yes, exactly.
It does. It does. It does. When it comes to Soweto Gospel Choir and what, not that it's a political thing, what South Africa is today and what it stands for is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And one could talk about that. So it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because music, I was in music for music. I mean, I loved music, and everything I was doing, I was learning. And if I dealt with black guys, I would be learning the way they did harmonies and the way that they approach certain things. I wasn't in it for politics, but what is amazing is that there isn't really a musician or an artist that I've dealt with who doesn't have a political awareness. They may not be political, right, but they are aware that things are not right if they're not right, and that we are working towards a better society in some way through our music.
Right. Yeah, you hit on it. Yeah, and that oppressive state, and I mean, even throughout history, just the resistance to change, you know, has always been there. And music has always been at the forefront of that. You know, the burning the records here in the U.S. and you know the and that kind of thing, and Elvis coming along. It was like, you know, so yeah, it's you were right in the mix of that. Well, recently, or has it happened yet? A German label is reissuing that album on vinyl.
It has happened, and that was the most amazing story. It's one of these lovely stories. And that was, which you would have read up about, that was that a member of the label, a German guy, had come to South Africa and found this album somewhere in the depths of some record company and listened to it and thought it was fantastic, and was trying to get hold of whoever was involved, and fortunately found my name. And yes, they loved it. They did a fantastic job of taking the vinyl album, which is because we couldn't get masters. We didn't even know where the publishing was or how, you know, all these guys had disappeared long ago. And they did a fantastic job of, no, what would you say? They used some kind of technique. I wouldn't have said remastering because it wasn't remastered as such, but it was repackaged and re-put together. And that was lovely, but the only unfortunate thing was it was released just as COVID hit, and they had a lot of problems. They apologized and said, you know, they'd had to change their business model and do various things. So at this stage, it didn't go that far, but it has got a fair profile, as you saw it got onto that compilation. Yeah. So it's one of those things, yeah.
Well, maybe it will pick up some momentum and some steam, you know, as we're talking, you know, in the near future too.
It could be.
Stranger
things happen,
right? So anybody watching this, you know, search out that, and if you can pick a copy of that up. And yes, the Humphrey 1971 self-titled album. Yeah. Well, let's you and Robbie Callenbach Callenbach
Yeah,
work
Cullen. Yeah, they
Cullen.
put the CH to the end. It's a German name,
There you
Cullenbach. Yeah,
Cullenbach. You guys worked together later on in a couple of films, Africa and Touch the Sky.
absolutely so.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I love Robbie. He's passed on today, but he was, yes, first of all, he was a great talent. And we did work on a couple of films, and that for us was also a huge thing. Suddenly we were writing film music, if you like. And I do remember the very first time, I think it actually came through Chris Dresser and the fact that Robbie knew guys in film. And I remember the day he and I walked into this film company, and the guy started telling us, and he's using about 50% of the terms we'd never ever heard before. Um, he's syncing this. It was in the day of splicing tape, and he had all this machinery and stuff. And Robbie and I looked at each other, and we just carried on smiling and nodding, and we got the job, and we walked out afterwards. And that gave us a policy, and that is just keep smiling and look like you know what's going on, And we just kept doing that. And Robbie, so we did two like that, which were successful in their own right. And Robbie and I, we spoke about what we would do in the future. And I decided very much I wanted to stay with composition and what I was doing. He went and became a very famous music publisher for EMI Records in South Africa. And we would meet now and then. He actually gave me the break to Soweto Gospel Choir because someone had phoned him and said, have you got an international producer who could produce a Soweto Gospel Choir album? And he put that onto me. And he also introduced me to the English section and gave me the opportunity to do my first African album for international release for film and TV. So I have a lot to thank Robbie for, but he always he loved my music. I loved his. We were always that sort of, we weren't a Lennon McCartney, that would have been another whole thing, but we were that close, if you like. We had that kind of relationship. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, he was very integral in your future plans and career as well. Well, moving up to Albatross, a couple of singles. I wanted to ask you, Janine, is that the one from back the earlier version, or was it a different song from Maximilian King Trio?
It was the same song. It was the same song. We did it. Yeah, we brought a few songs ahead, if you like, forward.
And Lady Day. Do you remember how those fared?
Yes, I do. Funny enough, no, not funny enough. There was another top record company who was interested in this music, and this was not so folky. It was more commercial, more mainstream, and we did quite a number of songs. A different lineup at the time. A lovely guy called Jonathan Taylor, who I'm all in touch with now, had an incredible voice. Another guy who was very good with music and so on. We actually had a session musician playing electric guitar because we were all either keyboards or acoustic. And it got quite a high profile release. Albatross put out a couple of songs. Didn't do anything unfortunately, but I think Lady Day hit parade somewhere. And what was I would say right up to then, I wouldn't have called myself necessarily 100% professional as a musician, because most of these were amateur bands, and we would do various odd things, and guys would be doing other things. And it was only when I started, actually before I started with film music and so on, that I started playing professionally. And it's a whole interesting curve of its own, because I could play almost any instrument. But this particular top level band performing in a top nightclub in Johannesburg, and they were called Coffee and Cream. And the reason they were called Coffee and Cream was because, again, it was black and white. The two lead singers were male and female black performers, and the rest of the band was white. And they needed a bass player. And I remember auditioning to do this because it was a very prestigious gig. And I was as nervous as can be because this was going into a total professional thing. And this person that owns the nightclub is looking very critically at me, saying, "Go on, sing, do this, do that." And this Jonathan Taylor had been with me, happened to walk in, and I'm singing one of my songs, and he takes it over. He starts singing in this beautiful voice, and I just backed him, and I got the gig. And that took me into all of that. So that was then playing bass, and then the keyboard player, who was very accomplished, left the band, and they said, "Could I play keyboard?" So I said yes. And again, that was very, very demanding because suddenly the keyboard player in the band was playing all the brass parts, playing all the string parts, playing a whole wide thing beyond what I'd normally been used to. So that was a great learning curve and took me into the film music area eventually.
Yes, okay. Well, let's talk about that. Why the decision in 1987 to go into writing music for film and TV?
That is such a good question, Greg. You ask good questions. So
I appreciate
this band, I was now in a professional band, and we were playing long hours. It was a band that played till 3 in the morning and so forth and so on. And it was very, very good. It was great singers and great performers. It was a little bit cabaret. You get a new artist, and you'd have to learn what was happening. But what was frustrating me is I was very much writing music, and I would bring repertoire into the band, and we would perform a few of them. But it really was a cover band. It was doing other people's material, and that I found frustrating. And I thought to myself, it was fantastic. I was earning good money, had high profile. I had no problems with that, but creatively it was giving me a problem. So I thought to myself, how can I write original music and make it happen? I couldn't see myself starting a Beatles. I was a bit older by then. I could have maybe started an original band. That was quite difficult, as is any original band. So I thought, no, I should do film and television. That's what I need to do. So that was why the decision. Then that's fine. So now what we had in South Africa at that time, there were, I think, 4 channels of television, of which one was English, pretty much white English. One was Afrikaans, pretty much white, and 2 were black, traditional sort of channels. And this is now a whole thing. So anyway, long story short, I started to go and see companies, and I thought, I've got to turn up about this, and no one was interested. I mean, one of the, these, Greg, this has motivated me since to be someone who helps people get going in the music thing, because it's horrible the way it's set up. I'm generalizing, of course, slightly. And it is, you mentioned workshops and so on, and it is so much a motivation of mine. Because what happened with me with this film thing is I'd see a guy, and he said, he would say, "You've got to have a show reel." So I'd say, "Are you talking about," yeah. So he's talking about, my music being used in film and a show reel showing this thing. So I said, "Well, what if I've never done it? I'm starting." "Oh, well, then you can't, you can't do it." And so you get this kind of thing happening. So I thought, oh no, I've got to somehow get out of this. So I learned a little formula, and that is I started like listing out everyone who might know anything about anything on the film music thing. I was still playing for the band, so that was fine. I was still making some money. But I was frustrated. So my father-in-law, by then things had moved on, and I'd actually divorced Lisa, and I was remarried to someone who I've been married 40 years plus now with. And my father-in-law, who was, I knew him quite well and so forth, he said, I played golf with a guy and I think he's in the film business. So I said, oh, okay. And he gave me the guy's number. So I went to go and see this guy. His name was John Rogers. And he was, he said, yeah, they do look for new people and so on. But it was very hard. You come from nowhere. You've got no particular history. You can say you play for this big band, but that's not what they're looking for. But he was sort of interested, but nothing really was happening. And I'd seen a whole load of people. So, Greg, I had a list of numbers and so on. And I knew from my that you've just got to keep going with these things. And this is part of my advice. And this thing of having numbers and who you know and la, la, la. And I'd phone these guys every now and then and say, la, la, la. And I phoned John Rogers. Probably it was about a year later. And I was still banding. And he said, wow, I was just thinking of you. We need fresh blood for this TV series we're doing. And anyway, long story short, I got the gig. I nearly totally messed it up because I had my background in folk, pop and rock and stuff like that. And I knew I could write music. I knew I could write good music. But I did this whole score for this TV series in the way that I write rock and pop and whatever music. Now, the problem with that is it's in a certain format. You do your verse, your chorus, and it's a great song and la, 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 la. And I'd write a theme for each character. And I thought this was a great idea. I'd read the script and I had that idea. The film editor hated me because the music I brought was not ready to go to film at all. She had to cut it up and put it right and do this and figure it out. So the great thing was that John Rogers loved the music. So I got the next one and the next one and the next one. This editor lady actually helped me a lot. I went to her and I said, listen, I'm really sorry that the music was so, unusable for you. So would you tell me, please, how should it be? And she told me how it should be. And from then on, I was very good at this. And I probably did about 20 series for John Rogers. So the other factor on this, which I hadn't really mentioned, was that John Rogers was producing and writing series for black television. So the very first thing I had to do, and I had a Western sort of background, it was set in Soweto, which is the township near Joburg, and it's a very vibrant black township. And it had all these characters I could rattle off, but anyway, like a black minister of religion. It had a shebeen, which is like a bar, but a black bar. It had schools and kids and so on. So the music, I could do the Western pop thing, but I had to understand now the culture that I was dealing with. This guy was Zulu. So what did that mean? What the heck was Zulu music? What would that, how would that work? What would they play in a shebeen? Okay, they're dancing away, but they're not dancing to the Beatles, I assure you. They don't even know who the Beatles are. It's a totally... So this was a learning curve, a very, very valuable learning curve for me. These 20 TV series that I did would be in different African languages and would demonstrate different African culture. One thing I did was called Jesus Loves Me. It was obviously a religious thing, but it was about the conflict between a sangoma, who is a witch doctor or a very traditional African figure, and a mission school. So for me, the music had to have the mission. I mean, I remember phoning a guy and saying, what did they play? And it was set 100 years ago. So I said, what were the Zulus playing 100 years ago? And the guy said, yeah, you've got a problem. There are no recordings of what the Zulus were playing 100 years ago. But he was very useful. He could tell me what the traditional instruments were. I could get some idea. And yes, in Zulu culture, what they sing today is a version of what they were singing 100 years ago, if you start figuring out where it came from and so on. So that was a beautiful journey, a whole new world of creating.
Yeah. Well, I imagine the research you had to do was interesting too. A lot of that.
The one thing, Greg, is I also knew that the audience for these were Black Africans. So I couldn't be doing something that they're going to go, oh, no, you've got to be kidding me, or whatever. It had to have an authenticity. I did find the audience liked certain elements of white music, amazingly classical, which was quite not all round, but generally what you and I would know as Western pop. No, I said maybe, okay, Michael Jackson, Otis Redding, black artists, international artists were known. But so if I was going to get the next TV series, I'd better know what I was doing. So you're exactly right. It had to be well researched.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, how fascinating. Was that let me see if I pronounce this right. Bachelor films?
Bateleur film. That was
That's
John
what
Rogers. Bateleur.
that was.
A bateleur, just for your, is an eagle,
Oh,
which here in Southern Africa it's called and it's got a beautiful red beak and so that's a bateleur, and that's what the film company was. Yeah.
that's what that is. Okay, all right. Well, one advancing a few years, one in particular in 1998, The Colors of South Africa double CD.
Yeah.
Released on KPM. KPM is one of my favorite labels. I've always sought out, and that kind of library music, a lot of it, the easy listening music from like the late 60s, early 70s. I've always enjoyed that kind of library music. I did an interview, one of my early ones with John Cameron. Are you familiar with John?
I know the name. Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. Famous.
And
Yeah.
he did some of that, on KPM. But and you began after this release being recognized more internationally as well.
Absolutely. I'm very impressed that you even know KPM, let alone know so much about it. KPM, you would know probably as Keith Prowse Music, and they were pre-Victorian times. They were the first people, as far as I understand, who saw the potential of getting music together for film and television, which at that time, or film at that time, which had gone from silent movies into something more meaningful. And KPM, as you rightfully outline, is the top music library in the world. And it is there because, and I know some of the guys there, they're uncompromising on their quality.
Right.
So, as you would know, they do Chinese orchestras, they do whatever, and they're always top. They don't mess around with whatever. So I mentioned Robbie to you, and the story behind Colors of South Africa is that Robbie was representing EMI, which represented KPM in South Africa. And he particularly knew a guy called Peter Cox, who was running KPM in the UK. And I was talking to Robbie. So Robbie said, you know what I'm going to do? This guy, Peter Cox, is coming out to South Africa to meet me and see the company and that. I'm going to sit him next to you at a dinner and you do your magic. And I ended up sitting next to Peter Cox, a beautiful guy. What a lovely guy. He's recognized probably in this sort of world as one of the top creators and a true musician. He'd been in bands. He'd worked with so many different people, and a person who loves musicians and artists. And he was sitting next to me. And we went on and on about the music, and they didn't have any Africa catalog, really. They didn't know anything about African music. They had a whole range of stuff. I don't, possibly nothing. I think they'd issued one in earlier years. Anyway, he got so excited. I said to him, I know a bit about what you do, but we should do an authentic African album, but that is geared towards film and TV usage, because African music is not naturally geared to that. It's like pop music. It goes in one way, but it's different. And he got really, really excited, and he commissioned me to do this album. And I was so nervous about this. As you say, suddenly now I'm going into the top area. But I think I was quite clever. I spoke to Robbie and I said, how do I, where do I go on this? Because you could go, I mean, there's tons of African music. There's lots of different styles. It goes very traditional, then it goes, there's a mix of instruments, and then there's the modern stuff and a whole lot of stuff. And from Robbie, I got a good idea of the studios that were using this kind of music in South Africa. And there were many, many of them. And I phoned them all. I said to them, what do you need when you're talking African music? And that they all said, we haven't got enough. There's very, very little. It should be anthemic. It should be this, needs atmospheres. They didn't need very, very traditional stuff. Like, it wouldn't be a case of doing albums of very, very traditional Zulu, Xhosa, the various whatevers. They needed stuff that could be used for film. And man, I was clever because I got that. I understood that, and I started writing the music for that. And I recorded, they gave me a very nice budget. I recorded, I don't know if you know Peter Thwaites. Peter Thwaites, an English engineer, but lives in South Africa, and he'd been involved with Graceland. And he knew quite a bit about how that all worked, and he was very, very smart and worked with African, with pop, with a whole lot of different stuff. And he had a gig, if you like, at Decibel Studios, which is a big studio in Joburg. And it was one of these really nice studios made in the old format, a bit like, probably, I don't know about, I'd say a bit like Abbey Road, but it actually was even nicer in lots of wood, grand pianos, booths for percussion, and you could really, really do it there. And so I recorded all the basic stuff there, and then I went to England, and there was a guy, Curtis Schwartz. He was very famous for, which I forget right now, Susie and the Banshees was his band.
Right.
His group, and he was doing a lot of stuff for KPM in Oxford, and he had a beautiful studio. So I took all the stuff there, and we found like interesting things, like it had been the stuff I recorded in South Africa was slightly slower and slightly lower in pitch than the way he worked. So we had to convert everything, but that was fine. And he was really, really, he'd worked on so many KPM albums. He could listen to a thing and say, look, we need a particular like reverb on this, or you need to separate it this way because, la, la, la. He was great. So I really got trained, if you like, on international releases. And that was going to be a single CD, ended up being a double CD. It was a smash hit in the library world. It was so used. It started a whole trend of other people climbing on the bandwagon doing similar albums. It got used a lot in South Africa per what I'd done, and got used a lot around the world. It got used, for UN campaign, or this campaign or that campaign. You mentioned my music is used around the world. That's because of KPM. That's because they reach out everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it must have been exciting to be on the forefront of that kind of movement. Yeah.
I mean, you're dealing with guys all. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
You go ahead. Sorry, I'm here a lot, so I every now and then I should just shut up for a moment.
No.
Just let me know what you.
That's quite all right, Robin. What I prefer is, I know you guys like to talk, is I want to hit the record and just sit back and you tell your story. I'll enter questions from time to time. If it becomes a little bit of a lull or what, but most of the time I just like to hear you guys talk. So that's what this is about, telling your story. Well, I'm interested in hearing about. I'm interested in hearing about the band Praying for the Rain and your work with them.
Well, that was a very interesting area. This again came from Robbie. EMI I can't remember, it might have been Parlophone or whatever, that internationally had released Praying for the Rain. Oh, no, sorry, I'm talking Praying for the Rain. That's actually, I was going to tell you about People Like Us, which is another thing. That was a whole dance market thing, which we could go. And Praying for the Rain, how did that happen? I met them, those two brothers, and they really are an amazing combination of Canadian, American Indian, and Canada. Quite how that all happened, I don't know, but they were very passionate. I met them through someone or another, and I went to their studio in London. They had a little home studio, and they were working on some stuff, and I got fascinated by the parallels between the Indian side of things and the African side of things. Obviously, the music's very different, but the heart of it, the heart and soul, the traditional aspect, and it's like Aborigine music, for example. There's a certain very deep world music. You know, in my side of things, I had a whole epiphany change when I met a Bushman. I wanted to add this guy to an album. And when he started telling me of the tradition of the Bushmen and going back to the, you know, what they believed and what they about the environment and so on, absolutely fascinating. And there was a similar thing with Praying for the Rain, because of course there you've got a heck of a history, you know, with the colonization, if you like, of America and what happened to those groups and what they were like first. They were not unlike Africans. They were you know, travelers and so on. As people, they didn't necessarily stay in one place. They'd do something somewhere and then move somewhere else. And the music was very, very built into the people. You know, it was people music. When you talk about folk music, traditional, you know, English and all that is similar, but it's sort of moved into another whole thing, which is much more modern. But gee, this music is heartfelt. So when you're dealing with it, so I really enjoyed it. We did a sort of an album together, and that took us on a journey. And I managed to use the people I knew that it could get released through KPM and so on. So it was good.
Well, you mentioned you know, the different manifestations and branches of music, you know, that all kind of stemmed from roots music. And if you go back to the roots, to the beginnings, you know, how similar across the globe the music is, you know, and it's you know, it's all kind of like a one world kind of a thing, you know, and that's the way it originally was. And then, you know, as people, you know, migrated and moved around and, you know, absorbed other cultures and that kind of thing, it all, you know, started to change. But yeah, when you get down to the roots of it, it's very similar. You know, I've found that.
You're absolutely right. And what struck me is how meaningful and deep the concepts were.
Yeah.
You know, these weren't, you know, they're not songs about, well, I went down the road and I saw this guy and I said hi and blah, blah, blah. It's nothing like that at all. It's very much like, what is the meaning of life? What are we here for? What are we trying to do? What are the values that we aspire to? Anyway, as you say, it's very, very deep.
Very, very spiritual and coming from the earth, you know, becoming, you know, one with Mother Nature and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's very, very, I'm glad to see that you did, you know, become involved in that so much. Well, you also worked, again, we've touched on that, on many world music albums focusing on African folk roots and gospel. I'm sure that that's been very rewarding, maybe to help revitalize a culture's music that was dying out a little bit, you know?
Yep. I mean, you probably would have seen from the notes that I started doing a lot of, on another line of country, a lot of traditional African or Southern African music. And it hit me very soon that these cultures are vanishing. The Bushmen that I mentioned, there's a lot of information about them. They're probably the most ancient civilization in Southern Africa. And, they look different from other Africans as well. There's a different genetic structure and so on. What was immediately apparent was just, again, how deep the whole thing is. And anyway, I could tell you many a story. I'm going to write a book one day.
Okay.
But I remember I'm shifting a bit because it's a whole load of cultures. So I mentioned the Sangomas. So I'm just going to take that up because the Sangoma, if you like, here, there's other names for them in other cultures, is your and you mentioned the Indian culture, and you get it in Australia as well. He's like the wise man. He's usually the guy who is in touch with the ancestors, or whatever that sort of belief may be in whatever culture you're at. And it's so funny because I learn more and more about cultures. So South Africa is very first world in one area, and then it can be very third world in another. So here you've got everything. You've got the Mercedes, you've got the internet, you've got the access to the world. It can be very, very, you got incredibly luxury hotels, incredible food, all the beaches are beautiful, and you can do all that. So that's all there, the first world side of things. But it doesn't matter who you, I have a friend, for example, a black lady who is a very highly trained medical doctor. She was very much in demand through COVID and so forth and so on. And I could talk to someone like that, and despite the modernity of what she's living with, the nice house, the car, whatever, and the people she's dealing with, the Sangoma and the ancestors have a powerful influence. And many of those more modern guys won't really talk to you about it. Yeah. So anyway, one thing comes to another, and I say to myself, I haven't done a Sangoma album. I would really like to get into this. And I had a very sophisticated black lady, a great singer. And I said to her, her name was Star, and I said to her, I'd like to do this. Do you think it can be done? And she said, absolutely, why not? I'll introduce you to some guys. So I saw a couple of Sangomas, and we spoke, and we agreed that they would come and record their music. I explained what I was trying to do, because I'm trying to also promote this vanishing cultures idea, and what is the depth of what this culture is about. Because these things are not understood in the West, and indeed they're not that well understood here, even by white guys or whatever. So I had this really, when I say I could write a book. So I had Peter Thwaites on the session, this guy, and we had the same studio that we use for KPM, and it's this very big studio. And he said, how do I set this up? So I said, I actually have no idea. I don't know what they're going to do. Just put mics all around the place. Make sure you can catch anything. And we'll put our fingers in our ears and see what happens. I don't know what's going to go. Also, with these artists, what I would do is at the end of the session, we'd actually sign the contract. Okay. That was very important. Make sure that it could be released, and it's all covered and everything's all right. And I usually did that at the end, because I never knew quite what the album might turn out to be. So anyway, these guys arrived. So Peter Thwaites, English guy, very experienced, and his assistant is an Afrikaans guy. He's the assistant engineer. And there's another black lady there who's like providing tea and stuff like that. So there's three there, and Star, the lady, comes in, and these guys move into the studio, and we start recording. What they do is they're doing a full-on call to the ancestors. I mean, it's full on. It's in the studio, and they're going down, and they're hitting the drums, and they're doing. I mean, it's really freaky. The first thing that happens is this Afrikaans engineer says, "I can't take it." He's gone. he's out of there. The next thing is the tea lady says, I can't say, she's out of there. So it's me and Peter, recording these guys. I mean, it wasn't that freaky, but you knew that they were doing their thing. I mean, and I don't know if anyone had ever recorded this. I have no idea. I don't think so. So they finish, and it's all, and I've got the recordings now, and it's all fine apparently, and they're all together. And then I'm sitting with Star at the end, and I said, right, so now we need to do the contract. And she looks at me and she says, I'd rather not do it now. So I said, well, okay, it's best to do it now because the guys are here, they can sign or whatever. No, I'll come back to you in a couple of days. Okay, good. Okay, that's fine. After this, I just can't get hold of her. I cannot get hold of her. Eventually, I get hold of her and she said, look, I can't do this. I can't put anything in writing. If anything goes wrong, I'm dead meat. I'm sorry, we can't do it. And to this day, I've never been able to release that album. I can't get a written. Oh, can you believe it? So that was still one aspect of my life, and I've still got recordings. And I've thought various times but I can't release. I can't do anything with it. I've got nothing written that I could use it at all.
And you've lost touch with Star, have you?
Yeah, I did. She kind of went missing. I met her the one time. I heard that she died at some point, but I don't know if that's strictly true. I haven't pursued it since. There's been so much else going on. Now that I talk to you, I think I wonder whether I could resuscitate that in some way, But I don't know. There are these days, the sangomas are incorporated into the health department because they do a combination of Western medicine and traditional medicine. So it is something which maybe I could find someone and say, how could I utilize this? Because it should be heard. But then I'd also have to sit with someone who would have to tell me what was going on, because that's the other thing, is to do the liner notes for these things is a huge whole different thing. You have to know what you're talking about, what's the language, what's the title, what's it saying. Anyway, there you go. There's one story. There are other similar stories, not as spooky as that, but with different people.
That would be something if that could be released at some point. That would be wow. Well, in 2006, you co-wrote and co-produced Tribal Beats with Johnny Clegg's backing band. He's always been one of my favorites, and sad to hear of his passing a few years ago as well. Yeah.
So a very good friend of mine is Barry van Zyl. And Barry van Zyl is Johnny Clegg's drummer. And a very, very competent man who knows African percussion as well as drum kits very well. Trained in LA, but South African, and very, very good at what he does. So Barry and I met at some point and we started talking about projects and this and that. And so I said to him, I'd love to do something with you. What could we do? And we actually did a number of different things. And one of them was this Tribal Beats. So what the idea there was to give a panorama of rhythms that are used in Africa, get them played by good players, and put this kind of an album together. And it went through another record label that I was doing a lot of traditional African stuff for, ARC Music. So he put together this idea. So we ended up with really Johnny Clegg's band being the major players and singers. A couple of the singers and Concord, the bass player, very nice, lovely guy. I pretty much wrote the stuff based on traditional formats and so on, because it came from West Africa, from all different areas. We recorded the drums in a place in Cape Town. Phenomenal drums. Some of them are just so huge, so big. I could tell you stories about African drums blowing apart Soho in London. They are loud and that powerful. Anyway, we got this all together, and that's where I really met Johnny Clegg's guitarist. And somewhere along the way, then Johnny Clegg got interested in putting a track of his own on it. And I hadn't really met him, but we met. A lovely guy, also totally motivated by the good, a guy who had lots of political pressure and a whole lot of different things. And one thing I was very proud of with him, I'd done a traditional Zulu album, which is got a whole nother story to it. And he borrowed it from me, and he came back to me and he said, this is the most authentic and best Zulu music I've ever heard. And I thought, I'll take that as a huge compliment. His is like unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that's what with Tribal Beats. It got released. It got a moderate release, a moderate reaction worldwide. ARC Music, the lady that particularly I work with, absolutely love this album beyond many. And there it was, another one on the list.
Yeah. Another one for your CV, right?
Exactly.
Well, I want to hear about how special it was working on the soundtrack to the We Are Together documentary for the Children of Agape Project.
Yes, I mean, it was so lovely. I guess at some point in my career, I had a certain profile. So people would contact me because there weren't all that many people who had my knowledge of African music and an international perspective with it. So that came through. Someone contacted someone and asked me, would I help with this album? Now, the Children of Agape, there was a British charity organization that was helping them. They had this tragic story, which you probably would know. It was an orphanage because their parents had pretty much all died of AIDS. So it was the kids, the kids had to start running their own lives. And some of the older kids were helping the younger kids and so on. And it became an orphanage and got some backing and so forth and so on. And they had their own choir, a beautiful, a kids choir that was really, really well done. And this English charity wanted to release an international album. They asked for my help with it, and a couple of other people. So I suggested, because I'd just done something with Lady Smith Black Mambazo, and of course Soweto Gospel Choir at that time. So I suggested, why don't we put get them on the album as well, and they can work with the kids or whatever it is. And that's what we did. And it was one of those, it ended up being pretty high profile. I hope it raised a lot of money for them. I'm not sure where it went at the end of the day. It sounded great. And we ended up mixing and mastering it in the Swing Man's studio in Mark Knopfler in London. It was mixed there. Okay. So that was lovely. I didn't meet him, but he had the most beautiful studio. He got which had these BBC very old sets of equipment and systems and reel-to-reels, right through to some young guys who were really up on the current scene. So it was lovely. Like the engineer was also a guy who's very famous, but I forget his name offhand. I think he dealt with the Chieftains and various other people. And he could say something like, this needs your old traditional reverb, and they would bring out this huge blooming thing and put this reverb on it. So that was lovely. So it was very, very good. Also gave me insight into those kind of problems. Agape, they were in KwaZulu-Natal around there. So I obviously went to the orphanage, and somewhere in the middle of all this, the orphanage burnt down, which was terrifying, and they had to do a whole thing. But they ended up on stage with Paul Simon and someone else famous. Not with me, but they got some very good profile.
Good,
which was good. They deserved it.
Good, they did. Well, your work producing the Soweto Gospel Choir has got to be one of your proudest achievements. In fact, the choir won a couple of Grammys, and up for another one, right?
Yes. there were different things happening, but this was I mean, I love what I do. I think you love what you do. You know what it's like. I get up in the morning and I never know what the next day is going to bring, and it's always a beautiful creative challenge. And this was one of those. By this time, I'd done a lot of TV series, and I knew a lot about African music and so forth and so on. And someone called Robbie Cullenbach, they called him and said, I mentioned earlier, said, have you got someone who could produce this new choir we're putting together? And he gave it to me. So I went around and had a look. And I must admit, I had no idea. Obviously, no one knew what was going to happen. What had happened is the choir had been put together by someone um, who was very, very competent and had been auditioned, but had been requested by actually what turned out to be 3 Australian companies who had seen a show, a Moya, in Australia, and been impressed by the gospel section, and had written to this person in South Africa and said, could we put together a choir? They're a theatrical set of companies. They're not a music company. They do shows. They do all kinds of things. Some music, they've done flamenco and they've done various odd things, but it's shows. So I walk into this, and the good thing is they had the money, so they could actually do a really, really good production. But the choir was very, very competent. They're beautiful voices, but they'd never worked as a choir. So they were pretty rough at that point. So I sat in on a few rehearsals while they're deciding, what they're going to do. And the people putting the album together had a guy in mind to produce, which would have been actually a disaster if they'd done what he suggested, because he wanted to use the Western technique of recording, which is to get the best possible sound out of each part. So he would recommend that they record all the basses first, for example. Then they record and then put it together. Now, an African choir does not work like that. There's absolutely no way that you could succeed doing that. You've got to have them live. They've got to do their thing. And then I also had like an engineer who would say, they can't move while they're singing. And I'd say, I'm afraid that's a problem. This is your problem. They're going to move, and you've got to figure out how to get the sound, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I learned a lot. But honestly, Greg, I had no idea. Soweto Gospel Choir. I mean, who knows? It's a gospel outfit. Who would, particularly think it would hit the world stage, at all? Soweto was a good idea because people knew Soweto. And they were very clever, the lady that put it together, because they didn't go classical choir. You can get choirs in South Africa that are going, whoa, singing operatic style, whatever. And they're very, very good, but that's not African. She was very insistent on getting a real African choir, the guys that really could sing in the traditional African style.
Yeah.
So I produced this album, and it did have that sparkle. And I produced a second album. And one day we get this thing. It's been nominated for a Grammy. I didn't even know really what a Grammy was. I mean, not really. Obviously, it's a big deal. And we loved it. Everyone thought, oh, wow, this is fantastic. By this time, Soweto Gospel Choir was touring the US very successfully. They'd done the Edinburgh Festival, so they'd got an international profile for sure. And that's why I guess it got nominated or entered for a Grammy. So we all fly. I managed to get my wife. We're allowed to have 8 people go to the Grammys, So I've got my wife and me. We get the guy, the choir master, the record company in the US who released the record, and there's 8 of us, and we just think it's a laugh, because who would have thought? Really, really, no one thought we'd win a Grammy. I mean, what the heck? And we're sitting there, and the winner is, and it's us. And we all look at each other. Now, what are we going to do? We're supposed to go up. Anyway, so about four of us went up, and we gave these little speeches, and and suddenly we're in a whole nother world, and that was very, very interesting. I'm starting to meet Hollywood people, and it's another world of whatever, and I'm so proud of them. And then I'd produced the second album was the one that won the Grammy, and then the third one was released and won the Grammy, and the fourth one was nominated for a Grammy. By then I was also busy with other things and so forth and so on. But the choir, was singing with Dolly Parton and Josh Groban and, anyone you'd like to mention. They were a world class phenomenon. Can you believe it? Fantastic.
Right. Well, I would like to hear some stories from the actual choir members, what their thoughts were, about performing with these various people. What about taking them on tour? You said in the States. How was the audience? How receptive was the audience?
Well, first of all, I should say that I was the record producer, so I wasn't touring them. That was a whole unit that did that. But there were a couple of things which blew me away. One was a performance they did at the Edinburgh Festival. And I had a friend who's a Hollywood actress, very, very American, knew nothing about Africa at all. And I think she was in England, I was in England or whatever, got the invite to go to the show. And she said, no, she'd love to go, and we went to the show. Now, the show had been very cleverly put together because they'd use a member to speak in English and explain what was going on. They were singing in up to 7 languages. I mean, it's like crazy, and you're sitting in Edinburgh and then American. I mean, and I'm thinking, I don't know, whatever. She was on her seat, and so was everyone in the audience because of the rhythm and the power of the music. And I think that blew away the choir because, no, they didn't know how to expect. There's a white audience in a foreign country, and they're singing in Zulu and Pedi and whatever they're singing in, and these guys are going nuts. The show was very well produced because they had one of the black guys, one of the choir members, was the dance instructor, and made sure that they were coordinated on their dance. They also spent a lot of money on costume. It was very, very colorful. But the show was really lightweight. It was like one light and no particular background or anything. There were good sound systems and a lot of mics. The thing with African choirs, another thing which I knew is that the soloist is not a soloist like you and I would say John Lennon singing the lead on this song. It's not like that. Soloists, and usually there may be 4 or 5 in a particular song, are an integral part of the choir, even though they solo. This, by the way, was an argument when we were mixing it. We had some overseas guys said the choir's got to go right down, the soloist's got to come forward. No, that's not the way the choir operates. Anyway, in the performance, the solos are so powerful. Yeah. They were only using really 2 drums, 2 djembes on the side, not for every song either. So a lot of it was a cappella, was relying on the power of the choir. But this reaches a Western audience. I saw them perform in London another time, and they had the same thing. And they would, because they knew it would work, they would get the audience up towards the end to dance. Guys would go out of their heads and they'd be doing African jive and whatever they were doing. So they were very well received. I don't know, quite in London, probably 50% of the audience actually was South African. So I don't know how many Africans in their journey were going to the shows, probably quite a few, who'd be, people have often said to me, oh, you want to see Soweto Gospel Choir? They're from Joburg, but they're living in Florida or something. And when they perform, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was the story. That isn't the whole story of Soweto Gospel Choir. I would just add that I got to know them very, very well. So one of the stories that a Hollywood film producer got really interested in is one of the singers was 15 years old.
Okay.
And he couldn't get a passport and couldn't leave the country. And there was a whole lot of things. And the story goes, and I think it is totally true, that her case ended up in front of Nelson Mandela, who personally authorized that she could travel. they would have very interesting things, like there's food that they particularly like, which would never be available overseas. So, they had to have a whole section that brought food so they could have what they love. Sometimes guys would get ill. A couple of guys died at various times. Maybe a guy would have, I don't know, some disease and so on. So I know Beverly Breyer, who really was the mama of the whole choir, would get a call at 2 a.m. from someone saying, the heating's too cold. We're dying, we're freezing. Or so-and-so's got a hospital and we have to, anyway, that kind of thing. So there was it was hard work, I think. And, they were doing one-night stands. And there must have been 30 guys traveling doing one-night stands in the US, one venue, and they'd be on the bus, they'd be in another venue. They worked. Wow.
A lot of travel and a lot of hard work, yeah, for that. Wow. I wonder, yeah, I'd like to hear that when they first started the choir and then where they had traveled to, if any of them could have imagined it would take them to those places, Well, talk a little. Go ahead.
Some of it
Go ahead.
is available. Some of it is available. You can hear it. And I was very fortunate in that what happened was they wanted to make the choir more their own thing. So they would produce their albums themselves, which was great, rather than getting outside guys like me, whatever, in. But they needed a lot of help, but they won another 2 Grammys on the way. But the last album they did, the Australians asked me would I help, and I went because there were quite a lot of technical things they were having a problem with, and they needed that backup. So I co-produced the album. In that album, it's interesting because that album had quite a few of what they'd call the struggle songs. The way that the album they were South African struggle songs, but also American struggle songs, and they combined the two. And in that journey, I found out even more about them because we recorded that album in Soweto last year, just down the road from where the Soweto riots happened.
Oh, okay.
And that, that story more or less, I guess. Like the one guy, beautiful, the lead singer, he's a tenor guy, he told me like how his family was, affected by this and how the choir had been affected by these sort of things that happened. And I guess after so many years, they're a lot more blasé about the fact that they've won Grammys and that they're world famous because they know that now. But, it's a funny thing. I don't think most of them even really got it, what was happening. I think it must have been bizarre, like being on another planet, there.
Right.
So I think they all had to come. I know a couple of guys, like the original choir master, who I love, a guy called Lucas, who was part of the first Grammy. He couldn't handle it after a couple of years. He had a wife at home, and he left the choir and went home. He didn't want to tour anymore. And he's still doing music. He's a very, very talented guy. And I think quite a few guys maybe found that too stressful for them, Yeah. So there you
go. Wow. Well, yeah, really unique and powerful idea, and then how it just came to fruition like that. And it's just wow. I mean, music is so powerful anyway, but to be involved with something like that, that's got to be really, really rewarding. Well,
I pinch myself about a lot of things.
Yeah.
I mean, and what I'm telling you, can you imagine that life? It's just been fantastic.
Right.
I'm now working on a whole bunch of projects. You wouldn't even believe what they are. They're from a children's thing. There's a guy by the name of Blues and Taga. He's got a very parallel. He's dead now, but he's got a parallel to Nelson Mandela. He was a political activist in the more radical side of things, and he had to go into exile. and he was known as Blues because he was an incredible singer. He ended up touring the world for about 20 years, making a living singing. And then he came back, and that's when I met him, and I did a traditional album with him. His story is amazing, and I'm a great friend of his daughter. He himself was a king, was a king. His daughter's a princess, and she's been writing a book on his life. And now we're doing a movie of it. I'm now doing the music, and I love it. I find out something new about that every day. Anyway, goes on and on.
Wow. Well, I found this very, very interesting. Talk about the concept behind the Gondwana Dawn Project.
You'd love this. I see where your heart is, and
Yeah.
so what happened was I was doing a lot of workshops for artists, for communities, stuff like that, in different frameworks. And the themes of those could be all sorts of things: human rights. Sometimes they were sort of anti-drug related or whatever, about the community, how to make the community better, how to develop artists in the community, all these sort of areas, which I'm very, very interested in. And Gondwana Dawn sort of came almost out of one of those. There was a company, I found out later, a company here who owns a lot of casinos. And if you're involved with gambling over here, you have to show that you're doing something worthwhile with the money in terms of communities and so on. So there was another friend of mine who was doing human rights workshops, and they were doing them in these schools. There were 7 schools that this company supported, underprivileged schools, if you like. And this friend of mine was doing human rights workshops for the schools. And she said to me, would you do one for me? So I said, sure. I'll do it with a sort of an art relation. Anyway, the result of that was this company approached me and asked me, would I do an art festival for these 7 schools? So I said, sure, and then I found out I went to the different schools and I would train them up on whatever, and then they would have an annual sort of big thing, actually in the casino that they own, which I thought was a bit sort of left field, because all these kids are walking past parts and the gaming. I wasn't going to worry about it. They were doing a good thing. So totally left field, this lady from India gets hold of me and says she wants to win a Grammy. How do I win a Grammy? She asks. So I said, well, listen, I know nothing about Indian music. She turns out to be a very Indian traditional singer. She's absolutely brilliant. And anyway, long story short, I say, why don't we bring some kids from South Africa, because I'm dealing with these kids all the time, and we do an album combining African and Indian music, and it can be entered for a Grammy and maybe, but anyway, whatever. And she really likes the idea. So I start listening to Indian music. I think, I don't know how this is going to ever time with African, but anyway, I go back to the company. I say, how about this? If you fund a bunch of kids going to India to do this, this would be like a step up on what you're talking about. And they said, fantastic. And we decided to call it Gondwana Dawn. Do you know why?
Why?
Would you know? Okay, good. That was the right answer, probably. So if you look at a map, you'll see Africa has got a shape, and I guess it's shaped like this, and India's over here. And India actually fits into Africa. It was originally, Gondwana was the second large continent that split into areas. So we thought we'd call it Gondwana Dawn, India coming back to Africa, or Africa coming back to India. So we did that. So we trained up these kids, and they ranged from ages 11 to 17, maybe. I don't think any of them had been outside of South Africa. We had to get passports for some of them, the whole thing. And this was another one of those adventures. We arrive in New Delhi, a nice little studio, but they'd never recorded a westernized choir. So they had 3 mics. I said, no, it's not going to work out. You've got to have at least 4, because we've got 4 parts in a choir like this. Oh, right. Okay. So this is then Sumitra, who's the traditional Indian, Sumitra Guha, she only records on the floor. There's a way you set up, Anyway, the whole thing was really, really interesting. I wanted to combine African percussion with the tabla, which we did do, but the Western way of playing even African music and a drum kit which we used is actually, funnily enough, slightly behind the beat. There's a way you play rock drums, and it's like, and if you were to actually do it, and if you get a drummer to play exactly to the beat, it loses a bit of that human feel.
Oh, okay.
But a tabla player is trained to play exactly on the beat. So put a tabla player with a rock drummer, you've got a problem. They're going to have to start listening to each other anyway. So this is what happened with Gondwana Dawn. We were very celebrated there. Fortunately, the Indians loved the choir. They thought they were like American celebrities or something. They weren't sure what they were. We went to saw the Taj Mahal. We did all of that stuff, and we recorded these songs. And I guess I put together the songs really, but I had to understand the Indian classical tradition. So we used a lot of Indian classical things and then added in the African thing. I thought the album should have done a lot better than it did. It got released. It got some very, very good write-ups. We got standing ovations over there in India. But it really wasn't picked up. I think even now we could re-release it. In fact, we've been talking about that and repackage it because it's amazing. And it combines Indian concepts of like Gandhi and Mandela sort of feature as the main character as an aligned perspective. We've got Gandhi's favorite Indian song on there. Anyway, there you go.
Yeah, and Gandhi spent some time in Africa,
Well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. He spent those were his formative years.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, Robbie Kallenbach, who I told you about, his father was a huge friend of Gandhi's.
Is that right?
There's a whole lineup there, but anyway, it's another story for another day. Perhaps.
Part 2.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think it's great, Robin, that you giving back to the community the way you do, with your workshops, and just being involved and helping people, along. I think that's great because, I think any musician or artist or what have you, like you mentioned earlier, you know what struggles you had to go through, to get where you're at. And you someone with a good heart only wants to share those, maybe make it easier for someone else up and coming, to
thank you. And you're right. You're dead right.
Yeah.
I mean, I do feel you're doing this for a similar purpose. What do we do this for?
Right.
If it doesn't uplift,
Right.
then what are we all about? And the world needs help, and I can't believe it carries on needing help. You think the world wars and whatever, that we wouldn't have another world war and another this and another whatever. Anyway, so we need this. It's needed every day.
Yes, you're right. Well, I wanted one more little thing I did want to, because I told you that I wanted to ask about this. You wrote a children's song in the 70s, the Mumbly Bone song, Stymie for Stymie. Mumbly Bone.
I'm amazed that you found that out. Okay, I suppose my sense of humor is a nonsense sense of humor. I love that. That's my sense of humor. I don't necessarily always write that. I have 2 kids and I have 4 direct grandchildren, a couple of other grandchildren. So when they were growing up, they're both into music. My daughter is a musician, actually. She is a singer-songwriter. My son is a very, very successful computer guy, but he loves music. He's got more music instruments than I have. So part of what I was doing was I would tell them stories. It's the father thing. I mean, a lot of these things like Winnie the Pooh and Alice in Wonderland came from this concept of telling kids stories. And obviously, I'm a music guy. So I just wrote this nonsense music song. At that time, I was married to Lisa for my kids. And it literally is just a nonsense song. Simey Forsyth me is this little kid, and he's got a little red petal, and he goes down to the bottom of the garden, and he kind of dreams. He ends up in this land or something where the mumbly bone, which I don't define, comes every day and washes all the tears away, and spanners fall from heaven. So that's like, and the seagum cream is purple and moves by the sand while the sun goes down. And they goes on and on and on with these bizarre characters and so forth. That was just for fun, and they loved it, and people have loved it, and every now and then I performed it. And then Lisa, who is was long remarried and in France, and she said to me she'd love to use this song as the basis for a children's series. So I said, well, absolutely fine. So she has written a whole lot of things about the mumbly bones, and the mumbly bones are these particular characters, and she's used a lot of the music also from Robbie that Humphrey had in the older days, and she's produced this whole thing. And she had her husband at the time he passed just recently, an English guy, also a jazz musician, lovely guy, had this real deep voice. So he did the narration for it. And at this point, it's only really gone through Amazon, and she's sort of released it personally, if you like. And that's the story of Simey Forsyth me and the Mumbly Bones.
I wonder, has there been any interest? Has she gotten any calls about the TV, children's TV show programs?
She has had interest. I don't know quite where it's all gone.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, I just told you. Anyway, it goes on and on. The one thing I'm doing right now is a kids project, and it involves stories showing how you can be a genius, encouraging kids to be a genius at what they're doing, something which is actually accessible to everyone. It's not, it's something that you can work on. And funnily enough, I've just written this, I just finished it right now before we hear a story about the mumbly bone, because it isn't quite the same thing. It's more like what's important in what you hear, So you hear this word mumbly bone, and you ask, what is it? Anyway, it's a kind of a nonsense story, and it goes into, but aren't spanners made of metal? If they fall from heaven, aren't they going to hurt someone?
Right.
And then what's heaven anyway? Of course, with kids and the amount of belief these days, one goes around that kind of carefully. So I'll just sort of say heaven is a very special place. Many people believe different things about it. Some people don't even believe in it, but it's up there somewhere. And these spanners fall down. So then the kid says, well, what happens? These spanners hit you on the head. And so the songwriter, I don't say it's myself, but it's the singer, says, well, these spanners actually are made of beautiful material, and they're used for building golden buildings in the sky. So the kid says, well, that's pretty useless. I can't fix my bicycle with a spanner made out of fabric. Anyway, it's this kind of thing. But the idea is that it tells you a story about what you can do if you start thinking about it, and that's it. So.
Right. I like that. Yeah, you're having a lot of fun with that, I can tell. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I know your plate is really full, and you stay busy and you stay active. What besides the book you said you're going to be working on? What else is on the immediate horizon?
Agenda. I mentioned this guy Blues and Taga. So what that is, it'll probably be a Netflix style TV series. My angle on it is going to be to write an album. So he was Xhosa, which is the same as Nelson Mandela. So now I put together, there are some amazing Xhosa instruments, and I've put them together so they can be traditionally put together into a filmic sort of an idea. And I want to produce what, I'd like to be a very successful combination of Xhosa traditional and pretty much cutting edge world music that anyone would love. So I'm working on that quite a bit. There's quite a bit to doing that. There's a scriptwriter in the US who's working with it. As I say, there's Noni, the daughter, who's providing a lot of that information. So that's ongoing. Then there's another Hollywood project, which is also an album. It was going to be a movie. It was going to be a movie actually about Soweto Gospel Choir. But they're kind of changing the angle slightly more onto music. And it's an interesting thing. And I'm writing the music. It will be, it may or may not feature Soweto Gospel Choir, the album, but it will feature a choir. And again, it's quite an interesting crossover of what Hollywood wants out of something and what I want to make sure is the real thing. So that's two things. There's this children's thing I'm working on, which if it works out, will be huge. It's going to be huge. That, funny enough, is consulting my writing skills, as in writing stories, more than the music, because that is something that I do. And what is also, you talk about this thing of helping. So probably every day I get someone contacting me and saying, how can I succeed in the music business or whatever? So probably I see 2 to 3 people, maybe a week. Like I've got a guy now, he's an Israeli guy. And he's very talented. I've heard his music and he wants to know how to make it. So probably tomorrow I'll spend 2 or 3 hours, because this takes time, obviously, or the next day.
Right.
My wife, I could probably go on a lot more, but anyway, my wife, we are both very passionate about the role of art in the culture, whether it's music or whatever. She's more into fine art. She has an incredibly successful company that provides original art from artists here to hotels, corporations, and so on. She right now is in Cape Town doing that. I'm going to join her in a couple of days. She asks for my help on that, which I do, and sometimes it's got a music element. Sometimes it's just working with artists. A lot of the workshops I do are related to what she's doing. So she will be putting art into a huge hotel or something like that. And she will have workshops run in the communities around that hotel where the kids produce some part of the art to go into the hotel. It might be butterflies or flowers or something that's relative to the message. So that I am passionate about. I mean, it's totally fascinating talking to kids these days in Africa, because in one way you can see the new Nelson Mandela coming with some of these guys, the way they are so bright. In another way, it depends how rural you go. They're not familiar really with Western civilization. They'll sit down and watch TV and watch some. I wonder what the heck they get out of. I mean, I remember a while ago hearing this thing that a lot of Zimbabweans were watching Dallas. Now, they're sitting, there's Who Shot JR, and the guys are making millions, and I'm thinking, what are they getting out of this?
Right.
Anyway, it's interesting because South Africa is in this position where it's becoming more and more high profile in the world.
Yeah.
And more guys, if they're going to have a career or going to do something, need to come to terms with the finance system, or how do you run a business, or all of these things. So that's what I'm doing, and every day my plate is full, but I love it, because then also when I talk to these guys, often it ends up being a music project. Like this guy, this Israeli guy, I'll say to him, what do you tell me about Hebrew music or traditional Israeli music, which I know nothing about? Right now, it might be very good to do an album that promotes, the Arab Israeli working.
Right.
Maybe he's the guy to do. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe he'd say, "Wow, yes, I know this guy or that guy," and so that could be another project. So that's happening all the time. I once listed. This is about the last thing I'm going to say. I once listed everything that I'm working on, and there are probably must be close to 100. There are like 5 pages of one-liners of all the things that are there. And I have to say, what are the 10 most relevant? And out of those 10, what are the 5 that I should be working on right now? And then what's the 2? I have to do that. But what I do try and do also is if I'm doing workshops, I will get other guys involved in projects too, which is nice that I can do that. If there's some potential in something and he's a guitarist and he's interested in something, then he can maybe take something on. So, yeah, does that tell you a little bit of what I'm working on now?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Well, I want to thank you for your time and for sharing so much and for your recollection and going back in time, taking the time machine, going back. These are always enjoyable for me. And it's just, I know it is for the majority of people I talk to. I know they get a lot out of it. So just keep pressing on, right? Right. And
Thank you very much. As I said to you, I'm very admiring of what you're doing. It's very, very important because you are adding to the spirituality, if you like, of the planet by putting this message out there as to what people have done, what they can do, and we definitely can make a better scene of a lot of different things. So thank you.
Yes, I agree totally, completely with that. All right, Robin. Well, I will, let's keep in touch, and I will
Yes.
shoot you over once I get this edited a little bit, and I'll shoot you over the link to it, and you can post it, on your social, and see what kind of traction and see what kind of reaction we get too. All the best to you, Robin. All right.
And
Peace.
to you. Okay. Bye, my friend.